Hello.
Hello.
My name is Cinnamon Roll, and I'm building a school bus into my full-time home. Before we get started, just a quick notice that I'm going to be on vacation next week, so there will be no video next Saturday. I will resume uploading according to my regular schedule again on the 16th of August. In last week's video, I installed the door, but I hadn't installed the latch yet, so that was my next order of business. First, I used a pencil to mark where I wanted the latch to go. I took the doorknob off of my camper and took it apart to see how it worked and to figure out what size of hole I would need to drill into the door. It was at this moment where I realized that I had a bit of a problem. My door was too thick for any standard doorknob to fit, and I'm too cheap to buy specialty doorknobs, so I decided instead to modify the camper's deadbolt to work with my door. First, I cut the bolts in half and welded in extensions. I had to do the same for the spindle. I call this the inner deadbolt cover. It has two layers, the inner structural layer and the outer cosmetic layer. I made a bit of a mistake when I extended the bolts and didn't quite make them long enough, but I realized that if I removed one of the layers of the inner deadbolt cover, it would give me just enough clearance to bolt everything up. So I used the grinder to cut into the cover and a flat screwdriver to pry the layers apart. I then began the process of installing the latch. Once I temporarily bolted the latch into place, I marked where the latch assembly would sit and drilled a hole for it. I then placed the latch assembly into where it would sit and realized that I'd made yet another mistake. I cut the holes for the doorknob too close to the edge of the door, which meant that the latch bolt stuck out by an inch or so. This meant that the door wouldn't close. In my utter brilliance, I decided that instead of fixing the problem, I would cut a slot in the door jamb that would allow the latch bolt through and thus would allow the door to close all the way. I'm not going to pretend like this was a good idea. It wasn't. Although it did work, I took a step back and I hated it. So, while I thought of a solution, I changed gears and switched to working on the cosmetic appearance of the door. When I moved the door from the barn to the bus, I dinged it up in some spots and had to fix that. First, I sanded the entire surface, and then I used spot filler to fill any cracks or dents. I did the same to the outside and then sanded and wiped everything down with a damp cloth. Once that was done, I primed the interior surface of the door once more. A few days later, during a spring flurry, I turned my attention to the exterior of the door. I started by sanding all the surfaces. I then wiped down the door with a rag. After that, I masked off the windows to prepare for more paint. I couldn't paint the exterior just yet because it was too cold, so I instead sanded the inside again. I came back on a warmer day and painted the door yet again with black primer. Now, I'd made a bit of a mess in the bus over the winter, and it was starting to get a little bit out of hand. So, enjoy this time-lapse of me cleaning it up. As great as it felt to finally have a tidy bus again, there was still work to be done, so I switched gears yet again to the door. Now, the color you've been seeing on the inside of the door up until now is basically a primer. I decided that now would be the time to paint the door its final color. You saw me sand the door earlier, but it was still pretty dirty, so I gave it a once over with a damp rag just to remove all the dust and dirt. The color I decided to go with for the inside of the door is this really dark brown. I think it's called bronze, and I really like this color. Now, I have a bit of a bone to pick with modern homeowners who seem to paint everything black, white, and beige. Like, whatever happened to color? Modern homes, to me, feel cold and clinical like a hospital room. I want my home to be warm, inviting, and colorful, which is why I'm going to be decorating almost primarily with wood, with splashes of brown, copper, and blue. So I had a bit of a rethink on the latching mechanism and decided to start over. The first thing I did was make up this bracket that would bolt to the door so that my latch would have something to rotate on. I then modified the deadbolt to do something a little different. I won't get into the details just yet, but I think it ended up working pretty well. The next clue to this puzzle is this bracket. You get where I'm going with this? Alright, I've kept you guys in the dark long enough. Here's how it works. I made up this latch that attaches to the spindle of the deadbolt so that when I turn the key, the latch slides into the bracket on the door jamb. It's kind of silly, but I tested it a bunch of times and it works. So I was going to end the video here, but I realized that it was only 6 minutes long, so I decided to roll these two videos into one. So, welcome to part 17 of Project Skoolie. Spring had finally sprung in its full glory, and it was nice to finally be surrounded by leaves, flowers, and green grass. This also afforded me the opportunity to finally get the camper completely gutted. I started by getting rid of all the trash that I ripped out in an earlier video and piled it up to be taken away to the dump. Next, I removed the water heater along with some exterior trim. After that, I removed the propane furnace. I then started on removing the stove, and I was unsurprised to find that it was filled with a mouse nest. I just cleaned it out and removed it as well. I plan to restore the stove and use it in the bus. After the stove came out, naturally the range hood had to be removed. I also plan to restore this to match the stove and use it on the bus. After I'd gotten all the appliances out, I started ripping and tearing. It seems my trend of finding weird things hasn't changed despite me working in the camper and not the bus. So there were 2 of these emergency escape windows, and I really wanted to keep these for the bus, because these types of windows are fairly expensive, and they were in pretty decent shape overall. Yep, that's how bad the walls were in this camper. I'm pretty sure the siding was holding everything together. The fact that I made it home with this thing is nothing short of miraculous. It's amazing how fast robins can build a nest. This was literally overnight. No eggs though, so I feel alright ripping this nest out. Sorry birdie, but you'll have to build elsewhere. Now that everything was out of the interior and all the stuff on the outside was taken off, I could finally start on removing the metal cladding and the insulation. Now, for this next bit, I completely forgot to film, but luckily for you, I made a wonderful animation to show what we did. Dunk. It's great, isn't it? Did I ever mention that I am not an animator? So yeah, my dad hopped in the tractor and used the bucket to push the trailer over. All I had to do now was clean it all up. Once the walls were gone, I had to remove the deck of the trailer. This turned out to be a pain in the rear and took pretty much the entire day, but you know, I got her done. Also, hooray for scrap copper! That's money in pocket right there. I did make sure to keep all the rubber propane lines because I'll probably need those for the bus. After the trailer was stripped to the bare frame, Dad and I moved it out of the way and then I started on cleanup. I first used a rake to clean up the insulation chunks, and then used a magnet to get as much of the metal out of the grass as I could. And that's all for this week's video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider liking and subscribing. It's by no means necessary, but it helps this channel grow. Also, a reminder that next week there will be no video as I'm on vacation. Thank you so much for watching, enjoy your day, and I'll see you next time.